people tend to be intimidated by energy, to say we have to leave this to the experts. It has to do with all these big complicated machines that we can't understand. It isn't like that at all. The energy problem is the cracks around my window.
We are now dependent on a very tenuous energy supply line. We think that our armies and our missiles give us national security, and yet a handful of people can come in virtually any time they like and cut off our energy supply.
Arguing about what sort of new power station to build is sort of like debating the best buy in brandy to burn in your car, or the best buy in Chippendales to burn in your stove.
After 5 years of firewood development recently, with no subsidies, firewood now gives us about twice as much energy as we get from nuclear power after about 30 years and $40 billion in direct subsidies. 1970. U.S. domestic oil extraction hit a peak and started to decline. The general public hardly noticed. 1973, the Arab embargo, and the resounding end to the era of cheap energy. Everybody noticed. Yet most people assumed that to stay prosperous, we would have to use more and more energy. And if we couldn't depend on foreign oil, we would have to find more fuel at home. Where would we find it? Hundreds of communities and millions of acres in the West would be affected by uranium, oil shale, and coal mines. We would drill for more oil and gas in the Arctic, in wilderness areas, and offshore. We would build over 1,000 new power stations and hundreds of synthetic fuel plants. This trillion-dollar undertaking would be impressive, and so would its risks. Such a scenario shows continued growth in overall energy consumption, fueled by growth in the use of coal and nuclear power as the oil and gas dwindle. There is an alternative, prospering by using energy more efficiently. In this scenario, nuclear power is unnecessary. Coal, oil, and gas are steadily replaced over the next few decades by appropriate renewable sources. By early in the next century, renewables would be our biggest energy source. By 2030, they'd be all we need.
I'd be delighted to send it to you.
It's easy to be pessimistic about our energy future. But Amory and Hunter Lovins believe that there's actually reason for optimism, that Americans can create a sustainable energy future. Amory Lovins, physicist turned energy activist, thinks the path we've taken in the past has led us up a blind alley. His 1976 landmark essay in Foreign Affairs, Energy Strategy, The Road Not Taken, introduced the phrases hard path and soft path to distinguish between conventional and alternative energy strategies. This essay began a vigorous debate on our country's energy policy. Hunter Lovins, Amory's personal and professional partner, is a lawyer and political scientist. For 7 years, the assistant director of the California Conservation Project, she designed and implemented environmental and energy education projects and coordinated an extensive program of community participation in urban forestry. Together, the Lovinses work as a team on energy strategy in more than 15 countries. They have co-authored 3 books with several more on the way. They spend much of each year on the move, consulting for governments and corporations and speaking to a wide variety of groups. Their exhausting schedule juggles countless speaking engagements with stretches of writing and thinking time, and even includes several weeks to work with kids at a summer camp in Maine. At an energy policy workshop in Montana, Amory Lovins delivers the speech which he and Hunter have developed over the years to present their basic ideas.
I think it's more important to get straight in our heads what the energy problem is. I'd like to do that by addressing 4 questions, namely, how much energy do we need? What kinds of energy do we need? Where can we get it? And how can such a policy actually be implemented? Let me start with how much energy we need. There are, of course, 2 ways to save energy. One way is to curtail or do without the services the energy gives us. Turn off the lights, leave the house hotter in the summer, colder in the winter, shut down the factories, leave the car at home. I won't be discussing any measures of that kind. I'll be talking only about ways to provide the same services as now, or even more of them, using less energy just by using the energy more productively or more efficiently.
When people invite us to speak, we try to go back to basics. We find that there is large confusion as to what the energy problem really is. People are hung up on which gadget to use, which technology to use, whether we need more oil, whether we need more coal. And before we get to those questions, we should really be asking, what are the tasks that we're trying to accomplish with the energy? And how much energy do we in fact need to accomplish those tasks in the most efficient way, in the cheapest way, in the most convenient way?
Let me try on you a rather mundane story. How many of you remember the pre-war refrigerators, which had the motors up on top? Well, those motors were about 90% efficient, sitting up on top, and nowadays the motors are more like 60% efficient, but they're underneath, and the heat goes up where the food is. As a result, a modern refrigerator can easily spend half of its effort taking away the heat of its own motor. Then, over the years, the manufacturers have tried to make the inside of the refrigerator bigger without making the outside bigger. Given time, they might, I suppose, have had the inside bigger than the outside. The way they did it was, of course, to skimp on the insulation, so the heat comes straight in through the walls. And then the whole thing is designed so that when you open the door, the cold air falls out, so it frosts up inside. So most refrigerators now have electric heaters inside, which go on now and then to melt out the frost. Then they also tend to have now a strip heater, electric heater around the door to keep the gasket from sticking, because it's too simple to use a fry pan style nonstick coating. Then all this heat is pumped out the back to a kind of radiator, which is often pressed right into that thin insulation to help the heat get back inside as fast as possible. And then the resulting refrigerator, if you can call it that, is often installed next to a stove or dishwasher, so when that goes on, it goes on. You can try if you like, but I think it's hard to come up with a dumber way to use electricity. And it turns out when you design the refrigerator properly, it will keep the same food just as cold, just as conveniently, using only 1/6 as much electricity as now. That's interesting because refrigerators, if you don't have electric space or water heating, are the biggest contributor to your household electric bill. If you do the same sort of redesign for all household appliances, you'd reduce your electric bill to about 1/4 of what it now is. Well, that parable of the refrigerator applies throughout our economy. We're in the position of somebody that can't keep the bathtub full because the water keeps running out, and before we buy a bigger water heater, we ought to get a plug.
Technical fix is another way to say plug. And there are a number of clever technical fixes around. For example, comfortable cars now on manufacturers' test tracks already get more than 80 miles per gallon. Cost-effective technologies available right now can double the energy efficiency of industrial motors and triple that of lights. And contractors are routinely building houses today that cost about the same to build as old-fashioned houses, but stay warm in the winter and cool in the summer at essentially zero energy cost. Discovering these technical fixes has dramatically reduced experts' estimates of how much energy the United States will need in the year 2000. In 1972, for example, the conventional wisdom of the government was that we were going to need 160 quadrillion BTUs, or quads of energy, more than twice the 76 quads we actually used in 1980. Some government agencies projected even higher needs, which we'll call superstition. But the Sierra Club's lower estimate was heresy, and Amory's still lower figure was beyond the pale. By 1974, after the oil embargo, the government's conventional wisdom was still below the utilities' superstition, but well above estimates by the Ford Foundation's Energy Policy Project. 2 years later, the government's forecasters had discovered technical fixes. You really can weather strip your house. And the utilities had discovered price elasticity of demand, which means the more they charge you, the less you buy. Amory's estimates in speeches and in foreign affairs were still lower, as they were also in 1978. But by then, the National Academy of Sciences and the government forecasters were also issuing lower figures. By 1980, an Academy panel and a government study were even saying we could be better off while using much less energy than today. Exxon was still in the superstition column. Our latest long-term calculations were still beyond the pale. But this matrix reveals a dramatic pattern that continues to this day. Every 2 years, the estimates of future energy needs drop diagonally, becoming one notch more respectable. In less than a decade, the highest forecasts for 2000 have fallen below what the lowest ones had been. And they're still falling.
So, how much energy we're going to need is a very important question. It determines whether we need to buy these supply expansions on which you're spending billions of dollars every year. But there's an equally important question which has not been much asked, namely, what kinds of energy do we need? Because there are many different forms of energy whose different prices and qualities suit them to different applications. Traditionally, we've ignored those distinctions. In effect, we've said all kinds of energy are alike. Instead of supposing that the energy problem is simply where to get more energy of any kind from any source at any price, we ought to be starting at the other end of the problem by asking what are the many different tasks that we want the energy for, and what is the amount and type and source of energy which will do each task in the cheapest way. If we ask that question, then we need to look at what types of energy are physically required at the point of final use. In the United States, for example, our needs are 58% for heat and 34% for portable liquid fuels for vehicles. Only 8% represents all of the special premium uses which need electricity and which can give you your money's worth out of it, because it's a very special, high quality, and expensive form of energy. Now, if you were going to use that extra electricity for running electronics, overhead projectors, lights, motors, smelters, appliances, railways, things that really need electricity, then it might be worth paying that sort of a premium price. But those special uses, only 8% of our total energy needs, are already filled up because we supply today not 8%, but 13% in the form of electricity, with more on the way. The difference, the other 5 units, is electricity that's already being used as we would have to use still more if we made still more. Namely, it's being used inappropriately for low temperature heating and cooling, space heating, water heating, air conditioning, sort of like cutting butter with a chainsaw or using a forest fire to fry an egg. It's inelegant and messy and dangerous and very expensive. Well, that implies in turn that arguing about what kind of power station to build is completely the wrong question. It's asking where to get more of a very special, expensive kind of energy of which we already have about twice as much as we can get our money's worth out of.
Energy planners use what's called a spaghetti chart to show where energy goes in a country. The different sources of energy, coal, natural gas, oil, hydro, wood, nuclear, go in on the left-hand side and get processed in power stations, refineries, and other plants. Converting and distributing the energy wastes a lot of it. Only what's left over can provide us with comfort, light, mobility, ability to make steel, bake bread, watch TV. It's for these end uses that we want energy, not for its own sake. There's no demand for raw kilowatt hours or for barrels of oil. For example, French energy planners sought the cheapest way to meet their country's biggest energy need, heating houses. New power stations turned out to be the costliest way, so they were to be discouraged as uneconomic. But meanwhile, more powerful officials started on the left-hand side of the chart. They said, foreign oil is unreliable. We need some other energy source. Let's build reactors. But the only way to sell the nuclear electricity was for electric heating, which they had agreed not to do. Which end of the spaghetti chart you start on, what you think the energy problem is, determines what you buy. If you start on the left, trying to replace oil by other fuels without regard to end use or cost, you might suppose you need more nuclear or coal-fired power stations. If you start on the right, you'll see that more power stations are the slowest and costliest way to replace oil or to provide the energy services we need.
All the measures I've described so far only stretch the fossil fuels we've got. They don't replace them in the long run. And having been raised as a normal, healthy technotwit, I always used to assume that the best long-run replacements for the oil and gas were going to be the big high technologies. Until about 5 years ago, I started shopping around for the best soft technologies I could find. And I defined soft energy technologies by 5 properties. First of all, they're diverse. There are dozens of different kinds, each one used to do what it does best, not trying to be a panacea. Secondly, they're renewable. They run on sun, wind, water, farm and forestry wastes, but not on special crops or depletable fuels. Third, they're relatively simple and understandable from the user's point of view. They can still, of course, be technically very sophisticated, maybe like a pocket calculator. I don't know how to build a pocket calculator. I don't quite know what goes on inside. But from my point of view as a user, it's a tool, not a machine. I run it. It doesn't run me. It's something I can make up my own mind about. Fourth and fifth, soft technologies supply energy at the appropriate scale and quality for the task they're trying to do, so as to minimize the costs and losses of distributing the energy and of converting the energy, respectively. Anyhow, I shopped around for the best soft technologies I could find, which were already in or entering commercial service, things that are already here and we don't need to wait for them. The best present art in passive and active solar heating, passive solar cooling, high-temperature solar heat for industry, which we now know how to collect even on a cloudy winter day in Scandinavia, converting farm and forestry wastes to liquid fuels for efficient vehicles, being very careful to protect soil fertility in the process, present hydro, microhydro, and a bit of wind power, perhaps for electricity, perhaps for running heat pumps or water pumps or compressing air to run machines. I then reached 2 conclusions which rather surprised me at the time but have since become much more widely accepted. The first is that if you add up the best present soft technologies in a particular place and you use each one to do what it does best, they will be more than enough to meet essentially all of the long-term energy needs of that place. I can't prove this is true for every place, but it's been true of every country so far studied. That's about 15 of them, including, for example, US, Canada, Britain, West Germany, France, Sweden, Denmark, and Japan. And that's, I think, rather a suggestive list because it includes countries which are in various combinations cold, cloudy, high latitude, heavily industrialized, and densely populated, or perhaps all of the above. Nonetheless, although the mixture of soft technologies varies a lot between those countries and even between different parts of the same country, there always seems to be enough if you use the energy efficiently. Secondly, although the soft technologies are not cheap, they're cheaper than not having them. Some cost more and some cost less. Mostly they cost a bit less than today's oil, but they're all cheaper in capital cost, cheaper still in working capital, and several times cheaper in delivered energy price than the hard technologies which we would otherwise have to build to do the same tasks. That is not, of course, the sort of economic comparison which you will normally hear being made. What our government likes to do is play a little shell game with costs, wherein they compare in cost with each other the things they like to build. Coal-fired versus nuclear power plants versus synthetic fuel plants. And then when it comes to the things they haven't historically been quite so excited about, like conservation and solar, they like to compare those costs not with the competing hard technologies, but instead with the old cheap gas, which we're going to run out of and which all these things are meant to replace. So they're rejecting as uneconomic a lot of renewable sources in the, say, 15 to 25 buck a barrel range, because they can't compete with 10 buck a barrel gas, when the alternative is synfuels at over 40 bucks a barrel and electricity at over 100 bucks a barrel. Well, that's just nuts. More formally, that leads to a misallocation. What we ought to be doing, of course, is to compare all of these investment opportunities with each other, not some with each other and some with the old cheap gas. And when we do that, we find, as the Harvard Business School study found, that in general, the cheapest investments are the efficiency improvements, then the soft technologies, then the synthetic fuels, and most expensive by far are the power stations. As a nation, we have been taking those options in reverse order, worst buys first.
With that wonderful technology available, there's no point in ignoring it.
It's not available to us.
You can come over to the office, I got a kind of a draft.
We're frequently invited to talk to the business community, and it's something we're very happy to do, not only because they control a great deal of the money that goes into the energy sector, but because increasingly it's a very worried community. They're beginning to realize that financing these large centralized projects is not what they thought it was, and they're beginning to get a sense that the energy game is changing on them, and they're not always sure they know what the problem is anymore. And one of the things that we try to do is to help them to reassess what problem it is that they're actually dealing with.
It's the wrong question. It doesn't matter which kind of new power station will be able to give you the cheapest electricity, because no kind of new power station can come close to competing with the real competitors, the cheapest ways to provide these energy services of heat and mobility. And those cheapest competitors are, of course, familiar things like weather stripping, insulation, heat exchangers, greenhouses, planting trees, pyrolyzing logging wastes, window overhangs and shades and shutters, things which in general cost less than the running costs alone for any sort of a new central power station, even a nuclear one. So if you've just built one like, say, Diablo Canyon, you'll save the country money by writing it off and never operating it. Maybe I should run through that one again slowly, because we're used to thinking that the competitor is another kind of power plant rather than the cheapest way to do the same end-use task. And I think it's a little hard to get used to the idea that what we're competing with isn't an oil or coal-fired power plant, it's weather stripping. If you were to turn on a newly built, say, reactor, all that you could do with its extra electricity would be low-grade heating and cooling, because the premium uses are already filled up. But all that it's worth paying to do low-grade heating and cooling is what it costs to do them in the cheapest way. Efficiency improvements, passive solar measures, things which come in at about 4/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour, whereas the running cost alone for a new reactor is 1 or 2 cents a kilowatt hour, so you're better off not running it.
You give no source material on these statistics that you presented us with. Are they God, U.S. government, my handbook of fraudulent statistical manual, or just what is the source material?
This is from the German government study and one by Murgatroyd. Because our primary argument is the economic one, that a soft energy path is the cheapest thing to do, we do have to depend on numbers. And some people wonder where our numbers come from. Well, we rely only on cost and performance data that are measured for real devices that you can go out and buy. And we're at pains to document where our numbers come from. Some people complain that some of our books and papers have more footnotes to them than text, but that's the price one pays for letting people go back and see exactly where the numbers come from. And I wish some of our critics were quite as explicit about where their numbers come from. Because there is disagreement about some of the basic numbers, we are also quite careful to use what are called conservatisms, that is, to weight the argument in a dozen or so ways unfavorable to our conclusions. And when we still come out with the same conclusion, despite making all these unfavorable assumptions, that's a much more persuasive answer.
Many utilities are giving low-interest loans to individuals and businesses to finance energy-saving measures. This may sound like a radical idea, but those utilities see it as a better investment than spending billions of dollars to build power plants that may never pay for themselves. Utilities with over 2/5 of U.S. generating capacity are already offering these loans to their customers because it's the only way they see to stay solvent. Not all financial people agree with such ideas, but economic logic is leading many to views a lot like the soft path.
If you don't think about the energy problem in terms of end use, because that's what people are buying in the market, and in terms of the economic dynamics of it, and if you in fact orient your thinking toward supply sources, oil, coal, gas, and so on, which is traditional, you may wake up one morning to discover a catastrophic change in what you had expected to be happening in those areas without any foresight, warning, or explanation. That's a situation that none of us, given our various responsibilities, wants to find ourselves in.
There are so many options for efficiency and for soft technologies that some will be right for you no matter where you live. Millions of people in thousands of communities are weatherizing their houses and getting more efficient cars, appliances, offices, and factories, because these are things individuals and communities can do for themselves. These accessible technologies are spreading very quickly. In the past few years, those millions of little energy savings have given us more than 50 times as much new energy as all of the expansions of energy supply put together. We've been solving the energy problem from the bottom up, not from the top down. Washington will be the last to know.
My interest in the Soft Energy Expo is to make it possible for low and moderate income families here in the city of Newark to survive the rising costs of fuel. It's my pleasure to help you today welcome Amory and Hunter Lovins.
The energy problem isn't too complicated or too technical for ordinary people to understand. It's something that each of us can get on with addressing and solving in our own lives. And if we realize that, then we're empowered as individuals and communities to get on with solving the problem.
Franklin County is one of the poorest counties in the state of Massachusetts. It's cold, cloudy, some tenuous farms, some old mill towns, a lot of people out of work, and very dependent on imported oil. When they looked at this situation and looked at the projections for the future, they realized that now they're sending out of the county each year $1,300 per household to pay for energy. Somebody held up a bucket with a hole in it to symbolize the drain of money out of that county. $23 million a year going from Franklin County to Venezuela, and they never saw it again. Then somebody added up what that $23 million amounted to. It turned out to be about the same as the payroll of the 10 largest employers in town. That got people's attention. They then asked, what about the future? If in the year 2000 they were so lucky as to meet the lowest official forecasts of energy needs and prices, things would be 4 times worse. The average household would send out $5,300 of today's dollars, not counting inflation, to pay for energy. Just to meet the county's energy needs, the single largest employer in town would have to duplicate itself every couple of years for the rest of the century. At that point, things begin to look a little hopeless. The future isn't possible. We can't get there from here. But then the people talked about what they could do instead, how they could stuff up the little cracks in their houses, which in most houses amount to about a square yard of hole, how they could use passive and active solar heating, how they could provide the liquid fuels for their vehicles from methanol, from the sustained yield of some of the unallocated public woodlots. how they could meet their electric needs with wind or 6 times over with microhydro right within the county. All of these devices that the machine shops with people out of work could make right within the county. And they totaled up what this would cost, $23 million. The same amount that they're now paying for energy, but the difference is you've just plugged the hole in the bucket. The money stays home. The jobs, the economic multiplier effect, stay in Franklin County. As a result, it's no longer a study. It's the Franklin County Energy Project, and they're doing it.
Some people ask whether the whole American way hasn't been based on producing more rather than using what we have more thriftily. I think we tend to forget too easily that we don't produce oil or coal. God produces them. All we know how to do is dig them up and burn them. And if we use them in an inefficient way, we run out. Then it gets very expensive. As energy prices rise, many people see the American dream slipping out of their grasp. And we can't guarantee that a soft energy path would bring energy prices back down to really the unrealistically low level where they were in an age when there was a lot of cheap oil. There isn't ever going to be a lot of cheap oil again. What we can guarantee, I think, is that energy prices will be much lower in a soft energy path than if we didn't do it, because then we'd have much worse price rises in the future.
We're beginning to feel that the energy problem has been solved conceptually, and while we're now faced with the very tough problems of implementing what we know how to do, bringing the solutions to people in the communities, Amory and I are hopeful that perhaps we can begin to move on to some of the tougher problems that are also facing us. Problems in water policy, in soil fertility, which are now in the state that energy was in the 1960s. People are not yet aware that these problems are lurking out there, particularly as energy and water and soil fertility begin to come together in an integrated resource crisis. We're hopeful that the lessons that we've learned in dealing with the energy problem can serve as a conceptual metaphor that will enable us to come up with some solutions to all of these other problems before they get out of hand.
If the Earth were the size of an egg, then all the water on the Earth would be just a little drop. And all the air, if it were the density of water, would be a little droplet about a 40th as big. And all the arable land would be a not quite visible speck of dust. And that drop and droplet and speck are all that keep the Earth different from the moon. If you take that sort of view of the world, then the fossil fuel, the millions of years accumulation that we're burning up in less than 100 years, for the most part, is just a little blip. History goes along for a very long time, and there's a little spike, and then it fades out again. And that, I think, is not an acceptable approach to our future. We hear many people now considering the future as somehow a short-term thing. And we don't like that philosophically. I don't think it's a moral position.
On one side of the house, you'd have a chimney sort of thing with a big black box on the top. When the sun's just about noon, when it's hottest, the sun reflects off the mirror onto the black box.
Your black box, heating up the black box
and
even more.
Makes the cold air come in faster and cools it faster.
Very good.
Now, George, this earth pipe cooling you've just invented happens to be... And we're trying to come up with an approach to the energy problem, and then we hope to many others, which will make it possible not only for our own children, but for children a very long time from now to live a good life and enjoy the earth as we have done.